I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
We're in Daniel chapter 5 this evening, and we're on page 12 of the books, if you have your books. We are down to verse 5. We started talking last week about Belshazzar's feast, how he had basically a drunken feast, a big party in Babylon. And they had gathered the gold and silver articles from the temple in Jerusalem, and they were using them in this party. But they weren't praising God in their party. They were praising the gods of the Babylonians and all of the idols that they worshipped. This was about, we had said, about 30 years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar was not the direct son of Nebuchadnezzar, but he was probably his grandson because Nabonidus, his father, married, I think, the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And so he would have been related to Nebuchadnezzar, but not directly his son. It was Amel-Merodach was his son who did reign after Nebuchadnezzar died. So let's read verses 5 through 9. We're going to find an event here that spooks Belshazzar, a lot like the dreams that Nebuchadnezzar had, sort of got him unsettled. So we'll get Naomi, then Henry, then Bill and Tammy. We'll do one verse each. Go around Daniel 5, beginning at verse 5.
Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote.
Then the king's countenance changed, and his sides troubled him, so that the joints of his hips were loosened, and his knees knocked against each other.
Verse 7, Bill.
Verse 7?
Yeah.
The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. The king spoke, saying to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck, and he shall be the third ruler in the kingdom.
Now all the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king its interpretation.
Back to the end of verse 5.
The king Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his words were perplexed.
All right. You might come along and what was the state of Belshazzar and the people at this party? How would you describe their mental state?
Drunk.
They were drunk. So you might think, well, Belshazzar's hallucinating. He's got this hand, this man's hand, writing on the wall opposite the lampstand. Now remember, the lampstand was an article of the temple. Lampstand stood on, I can't remember which side. I think it was the north side of the tabernacle, of the way the tabernacle was built. It's either the north or the south side. I can't remember exactly how it was supposed to be oriented. But the lampstand stood right across from the table of showbread in the tabernacle. And his hand wrote opposite the lampstand and the plaster of the walls palace, and the king saw the part of the hand it wrote. So you might say, well, Belshazzar is hallucinating. How do we know he's not?
Usually other people don't hallucinate the same thing.
Yeah. Other people saw this too. So that's how we know Belshazzar's not having he's not in a drunken stupor where he's just imagining something. Everyone else can see it too. And so how did the king's demeanor change after he saw that?
Where he turns, he's pretty freaked out.
He's pretty freaked out. That's pretty good. His thoughts are troubling him. The joints of his hips were loosened. Naomi, I think, has some idea about that. His knees were knocking. Like, as far as he was scared to death, we might say. He didn't know what was being written, but he had never seen someone write on the wall that way. He would have known that this was not from this world. Because all we have is a hand. Man's hand. So in other words, you can cut off your hand. All you have is a hand. Can't see anything else. And writing. And you can't read it. So what did Belshazzar do? What did he say? Verse 7.
Find somebody who can figure it out. Tell me what it says.
Yeah, tell me what it says. What will I do to you if you can tell me what it says?
He'll be rewarded.
He'll be rewarded. Nebuchadnezzar, I don't think in the two dreams that Nebuchadnezzar said it was going to be a direct, or it wasn't the reward that these men got. Daniel was rewarded for the dream in Daniel 2. But Belshazzar is not sitting here saying, I'm going to kill you if you don't. Nebuchadnezzar often did that. Belshazzar really wanted this handwriting read, and so he upped the ante, if you might say. He really made it. You read it, I'm going to give you you're going to be clothed in purple. That's royal clothing. You're going to have a chain of gold around your neck. That would be authority. And you're going to be third ruler of the kingdom. And I'd like us to note that phrase. Who, if the person who read this was going to be third ruler of the kingdom, what does that tell you about those who were ruling Babylon at the time?
There's already two.
There's already two. We don't read of the second. That's why a lot of people didn't think Belshazzar existed for a long time. Because we knew Nabonidus was the one who was the last king, full king of Babylon. We knew that from history. And they say, well, the Bible got it wrong when they talk about Belshazzar being the last king. It was Nabonidus. But you read a little closer. He wasn't saying you're going to be ruler, the second ruler of the kingdom. You're going to be ruler right after me. He would be ruler right after Belshazzar. Don't think I'm saying that. But he wasn't making him prime minister under the only king of Babylon. He was going to be third ruler. In reality, Nabonidus was the king. Belshazzar was his regent. He would be the second ruler of the kingdom. And therefore, he couldn't, the only thing Belshazzar could do was make a position less than him, which would be third ruler of the kingdom. Now, just like in the other stories, the king's wise men came and they couldn't read the writing. You can't really fake this. You can't really fake this. And so they couldn't read it. And Belshazzar was troubled, and his countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. They couldn't read the wall. If this was a sign from God, they wanted to know. Because obviously, the handwriting had some meaning, didn't it? So let's read verses 10 through 16. And we'll do 2 verses each. We'll start with Henry. We'll do 10 through 16.
The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. The queen spoke, saying, O king, kneel forever, do not let your thoughts trouble you, nor let your countenance change. For there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the Holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, astrologers, chaldeans, and soothsayers.
Inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the captives from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah?"
How far are we going?
Verse 16. And you can get the rest of it.
I have heard of you, that the Spirit of God is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not give the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of you, that you can give interpretations and explain enigmas. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple, and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom.
All right, so who is the one who finally speaks up? Who's the one? Verse 10.
Queen?
The queen. Now, this is probably not Belshazzar's wife. This is probably his mother. We know, we call, like as far as, let's just say when Queen Elizabeth became Queen of England in the 1950s, her mother had also been queen. She was married to George VI and was already queen. She was referred to as queen, or the queen mother. And so this is not strange that we might call the queen mother. And the reason why, or Belshazzar's mother, and the reason why this is probably Belshazzar's mother is because of what she says. She remembers that something from the days of Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar, I don't believe, is a terribly old man here. He's not a young man per se, but he's not an old man, and would have had a young life. She wouldn't have these memories and this knowledge from the times of Nebuchadnezzar. Plus, as his mother, mothers can often speak where wives may not be able to. Remember Esther. Esther was afraid to go into Ahasuerus without being called. She was not his mother, she was his wife. And the queen spoke up here. She reminded Belshazzar of something that he didn't know. He didn't remember. He would have been much younger then. And so, if this was Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, it would make much sense as to why she knew. Nabonidus' wife and Belshazzar's mother. Much more sense as to what was going on here. She said, well, I remember, or not I remember, there was a man in this kingdom who had the spirit of the holy God. Now, the way she describes him is not exactly what Nebuchadnezzar did, although it certainly looked like it. Daniel was not a magician. He was not an astrologer or a soothsayer. But to those who didn't know better, that's what he was. He could interpret dreams, he could solve riddles and explain enigmas. So to an idolater, this is exactly what it is. It's sort of like today, preachers are sometimes called pastors. And as a position of a preacher, not someone who is a pastor and a preacher. And it's because the term is being used improperly. And sometimes it depends on the conversation whether I focus on that, not being called a pastor, or whether just answer their question, because it's going to go right over their head. I'm not a pastor. If I've been studying with someone and getting to know them a bit better, and they still call me pastor, I'm going to have to tell them, I'm not a pastor. I'm a preacher. Here's the difference. But really, the focus of Daniel, when he gets there later, is not going to be, oh, by the way, you need to stop calling me an astrologer. I'm not that. Because that was not the purpose. This is what the queen said. Go get Daniel. And so that's what Belshazzar did. He heeded the advice of the queen. And he asked Daniel, are you one of the captives? In other words, he knew he was Jewish. He knew he wasn't Chaldean. Now, Daniel at this time is an old man. This is 538 BC. We know that because of what will happen later on in the chapter. We know when this was. 538 BC. Daniel was taken into captivity at 605 BC. And by that time, he probably was in his teenage years. He wasn't a baby when he came in 605 BC, so he could be approaching or in his 80s at this time. He's an old man here. He'll be an old man when he comes into the lion's den as well, in chapter 6. He's an old man. But his age wasn't going to be a hindrance to him. He would have been a wise man. Elders in that time, as they should be today, were respected generally for their knowledge and their wisdom. Just because he was an old man didn't mean he was frail. We're going to find in chapter 6 he wasn't that. He was still had all his faculties. He was still pretty strong. And Belshazzar came and told him exactly what would happen. You interpret this, all these good things will happen. So let's get 17 to 24. We'll do 2 verses each again. I'll start with Neil.
And Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writings to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship, and greatness and glory and majesty.
And because of the majesty that he gave him, our peoples, nations, languages, trembled and feared before him. Wherever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. And whomever he wished, he put down. But when his power was lifted up, and his spirit was ardent in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him.
Then he was driven from the sons of men. His heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven. So he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of men, and appoints over it whomever he chooses. But you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this.
And you lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which did not see or hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. Then the fingers of the hand were sent from him, and this writing was written.
All right, so Daniel, what's the first thing he tells Belshazzar in verse 17?
Well, he told me pretty much he didn't want any of the gifts.
Yeah. He's not going to do this for the money. He wasn't going to do this for power or prestige or anything like that. Then you can keep your case. I'll interpret for you. I'll interpret that, but it's going to be God who interprets. He's explaining to Belshazzar the reason the hand wrote on the wall. before he interprets the dream or the right, he's giving Belshazzar the reason why. Because it was abnormal. What did he first tell about his ancestor Nebuchadnezzar? What happened to him? Which we discussed in chapter 4.
We recollected what happened to Nebuchadnezzar being driven out of the palace and lived in the fields.
Now, why was Nebuchadnezzar why did that happen to him? Why did God do that? What was his sin?
Well, God wanted to show him who he was.
Yeah, that's true.
Oh.
Because why did Nebuchadnezzar need that lesson? His pride. He was a proud man. Nebuchadnezzar needed to be humbled and to be shown that it wasn't his power that kept his kingdom going. It was God. God rules in the affairs of men and appoints over it whomever he chooses. Now we know from chapter 2 that a kingdom was coming that was going to defeat the Babylonians. However, God didn't say in that dream when it would come. We knew it was fairly certain it wouldn't happen in the days of Nebuchadnezzar because he was the head of gold, the strongest kingdom of the four that were mentioned. And so we were fairly certain it wasn't going to be during the life of Nebuchadnezzar. But we do know the second kingdom is coming. Was it going to be 100 years? Was it going to be 200 years? Was it going to be, as we'll find out one night. That was up to God. We know from history that the Medes and the Persians were fighting the Babylonians at this time. It's not that God just poofed the Medes and the Persians into existence that night in order to take the kingdom of Babylon. Through God's providence, the Medes and the Persians were advancing, but they hadn't won yet. They hadn't taken the city yet. And if God so chose, they wouldn't. God could have waited. God could have done a whole bunch of things. But what was seemingly the final straw with God? What had Belshazzar done that seemed to be the final straw? The downfall of Babylon. And that was verses 23 and 24.
It was bad enough that they took the vessels out of the temple, but then they were praising the gods of silver and gold and all these other things on top of it.
If there's one thing you read of in the Old Testament that God despises, among other sins that God despises, is idolatry above all. Taking glory and honor and placing it in things that you made. In things that have no life in them. That thing God despises. And as Tammy said, it was bad enough they took the holy things of the temple. That was defiling them, and they were drinking out of them, out of the vessels that were in the temple. That was bad enough, but they were doing it in honor of their gods. That was the final straw. That was the final straw. That's why Belshazzar saw. We don't have to wonder why the hand wrote on the wall. Daniel said so. And so Belshazzar was going to be taught a lesson. Now, the question is, we haven't read it yet, was the lesson the same as Nebuchadnezzar, that you're going to be humbled, but your kingdom will stand? Or was it going to be worse? And so that's what we'll read in verses 25 to 28. Naomi, you want to get 25 and 26. Henry, 27 and 28.
And this is the writing that was inscribed, mene, people in person. This is the interpretation of the matter. Meaning, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end.
After you have been weighed in the balance and found the wrong. And for us, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians.
Oh, that's it. I was waiting for 29. I was waiting for 29 and I didn't give it out. So we'll keep it for a second. So we have three words. Now they were going to be interpreted. Daniel, remember, Belshazzar and the people couldn't read it. So it had to be placed into the Chaldean language so that they could understand what it meant. It was in some language that they couldn't understand, but Daniel could, and God interpreted through Daniel. So what were the three words? Not what they mean. What were the three words? They're words that we don't use, but and Upharsin. Mene, tekel, and Upharsin. These three words are Chaldean words. And instead of translating them, just like translators did with baptism, they transliterated them into English. That's why they have no meaning to us. It's because they are Chaldean and Aramaic. And what does mene mean? M-E-N-E.
That's numbered is the days of his kingdom.
And what? Finished. So it's worse than Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was told, you're going to be driven from men, but your kingdom will stand. You will be returned to it. Not so with Belshazzar. Your kingdom has been numbered, and it is finished. It's done. God has spoken. And he is the one who raises up kings. God has spoken. What does tekel mean?
You didn't measure up yourself.
You didn't measure up yourself. You have been weighed in the balances and found lacking. So in other words, God has got you didn't weigh yourself. You didn't do this. God weighed you in the balances, and he found you lacking. In other words, you're serving idols, serving other gods. This is why this is happening to you. Your kingdom is falling. He has numbered your days of your kingdom and ended it because you are found wanting. Because of your pride and your unrighteousness. Now, the third word is Upharsin in verse 25. However, that's not the word Daniel uses in verse 28. What does he use in verse 28? Perez. And this has always bugged me for years. Why does Daniel change the word? In verse 25, it's Upharsin. In verse 28, it's Perez. Let's first deal with what the word means. What does that mean?
Well, his kingdom had been divided and was given to the Medes and Persians.
Okay, so how is that different than meaning? So in other words, we knew his kingdom was ending. What's this last phrase doing there? What's that telling Belshazzar?
Tell him who's going to take the kingdom.
Or who's going to take the kingdom? What else does it tell us?
They'll be split up.
It'll be split up. It's not going to be one nation, one whole nation is going to come get you. It's going to be divided. And that really goes to the meaning of why Daniel uses Upharsin versus Perez. I looked this up. Upharsin is an Aramaic or Chaldean for divisions. The kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians, and that's in Daniel 5:28. Belshazzar's, I'm quoting here, by the way. Belshazzar's kingdom is being split between the Medes and the Persians. The writing on the wall read Upharsin, while Daniel himself uses Perez. Why? Upharsin is plural for divisions. Perez is singular for divided. Babylon is being divided once into two branches. Media and Persia with their respective portions. There's no contradiction here, just a linguistic variation to highlight two different aspects of this prophecy. One separation into two segments. So Upharsin is the two segments. Perez is it's divided once. So that's why you have the two words there. I didn't know that. I always wondered why there are two different words in the span of 3 verses. especially since this is an interpretation. And so Belshazzar would have understood that because these are Chaldean words. Once it was interpreted, once Belshazzar heard these words, he understood what they meant. Daniel told us what they meant. And so this was going to be the result. Your kingdom is ended. That's devastating to hear. But just how quickly it ended is quite amazing. Let's get verses 29 to 31. We'll get Naomi and just read them all.
Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him, that he should be the third ruler of the kingdom. That very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 63 years old.
All right. Belshazzar did what he said. He made Daniel third ruler of the kingdom. That was a great position Daniel had. He probably had it for all of a couple hours. Because that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was killed. They were having a drunken feast, and little did they know that the Medes and the Persian army was diverting the Tigris and Euphrates River. Babylon sat between two of them. They thought it was impregnable. They thought it could not have been taken because of the rivers that were surrounding it, protected it, and the walls that they had of the city. But once you can cross the rivers, you can get in the walls. And of course, when you have all the lords there and the king there, it's like sitting ducks. They aren't, like, as far as they were drunk, and the city wasn't as protected as it needed to be, and the kingdom fell in one night. Kingdoms fall when the capital is taken, and the capital is taken. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. We're going to get into who this Darius the Mede is at another time, next week, because there's just not enough time to talk about him, because there's a lot of, just like with Belshazzar, a lot of confusion about him. Who's this guy? Because in Ezra and Nehemiah, we know Cyrus is the king of Persia. Cyrus is going to be the one who gives the edict that the Jews could go back to Jerusalem. So who is this Darius? Because Cyrus will be mentioned in Daniel. But Darius is the king we read of in chapter 6. And so, since he is going to be the king in chapter 6, that's where we're going to pick up next week with Darius. But, just quickly before we close, this is how quick God can move. The writing on the wall happened the night before. Belshazzar didn't get an opportunity to repent. Didn't get an opportunity to change. And in fact, Belshazzar, from the story, it doesn't say that he really did change. He gave Daniel what he said he would, but not much else is said. Not much else is said. Belshazzar had passed the point of no return. Sometimes we can pass the point of no return. And that's a warning to us about serving God now. And so the thought question that's at the bottom, well, we're not going to sit here and talk about, but it's something you can think about on your own. If God were to have fingers right on the wall, on your walls today, what would he say? That's a sobering thought. Let's not think of ourselves to be proud like Belshazzar. We're not perfect people. What would he tell us? We're all wanting him to tell us, you're a good and faithful Christian. But is that what he would write? Or would he write something else? Would he write, you need to repent of this or perish? It's what he did to the churches in Revelation, to 5 to 7 in Revelation. You need to repent or this will happen. So that's just a thought question that you can think about in the coming weeks.
I'm not ashamed to